I still remember the exact moment I realized the man I admired most in the world wanted to destroy me. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and I was standing outside his office door, my hand frozen mid-knock, listening to him tell the dean that I was mentally unstable, academically dishonest, and that he regretted ever championing my acceptance into the graduate program. The words coming through that door felt like someone had reached into my chest and started squeezing my heart with ice-cold fingers. This was Professor Daniel Whitmore, the man who had changed my life, who had seen potential in me when no one else had, who had written me a glowing recommendation letter that brought tears to my eyes when I first read it. And now, hidden behind that closed door, he was systematically dismantling everything I had worked for, everything I had built, everything I believed about myself. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up in that hallway, how the man who saved my academic career became the person who tried to ruin my entire life, I need to take you back to the beginning. I need to tell you about the girl I was before all of this happened, about the dreams I carried with me from a small town in rural Pennsylvania all the way to the prestigious halls of Thornfield University in Boston, and about how quickly those dreams can turn into nightmares when you put your trust in the wrong person. My name is Olivia Marshall, and 3 years ago, I was 21 years old, finishing my senior year at a small state college, working 2 jobs to pay for textbooks and ramen noodles, and dreaming of a future that felt impossibly out of reach. I grew up in a town called Millbrook, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where dreams are measured in modest terms, and where girls like me were expected to get married young, have babies, and spend their lives working at the local grocery store or the diner on Main Street. My mother raised me alone after my father left when I was 7, and she worked herself to exhaustion cleaning houses for wealthy families in the next town over. She had this saying she would repeat to me every night before bed: "Olivia, your mind is your ticket out. Never stop learning. Never stop reaching." I took those words to heart. I studied harder than anyone else in my class. I read every book I could get my hands on. I wrote essays that my teachers said were beyond my years. And when I graduated high school as valedictorian with a full scholarship to Pennsylvania State, I thought I had finally found my ticket out. But college was harder than I expected. The scholarship covered tuition, but not books, not food, not the winter coat I needed when November came, and my thin jacket from home was not enough. I worked mornings at a coffee shop and evenings at a call center, and I studied in between, my eyes burning from exhaustion, my body running on caffeine and determination. It was during my junior year that I discovered my passion for literature, specifically Victorian literature. There was something about those stories of class struggle, of women fighting against societal expectations, of truth hidden beneath layers of propriety that spoke to me on a deeply personal level. I wrote a paper on the unreliable narrator in Wilkie Collins' novels that my professor said was one of the best undergraduate essays she had ever read. She encouraged me to apply to graduate programs, to consider a career in academia. The idea seemed laughable at first. Graduate school was for rich kids, for people with connections, for those who did not have to worry about where their next meal was coming from. But my professor was persistent, and eventually she convinced me to at least try. That is when I first heard the name Daniel Whitmore. He was a legend in the field of Victorian literature, a professor at Thornfield University who had written 3 books that were required reading in graduate programs across the country. His work on narrative deception in 19th century fiction had revolutionized the field, and his classes had waiting lists that stretched for semesters. My professor mentioned him casually one day, saying that she had been his student decades ago, and that if I was serious about graduate school, I should reach out to him. I laughed at the suggestion. Why would a man like that pay any attention to a girl like me? But I did it anyway. I wrote him an email, expecting nothing, attaching my paper on Collins and explaining my background, my passion, my dreams. I told him about growing up in Millbrook, about my mother's sacrifices, about working 2 jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA. I wrote honestly, perhaps too honestly, and I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. Then I went back to work, went back to studying, and forgot about it entirely. 3 weeks later, I received a response that would change the trajectory of my entire life. Professor Whitmore had not only read my paper, but had been deeply impressed by it. He said my analysis of unreliable narration showed a sophistication and insight that he rarely saw in seasoned academics, let alone undergraduate students. He asked if I would be interested in applying to Thornfield's graduate program, and he offered to personally recommend me for one of the university's most prestigious fellowships, the Hartwell Fellowship, which covered full tuition, provided a generous living stipend, and was awarded to only 2 students per year across all humanities departments. I read that email 17 times. I printed it out and kept it in my wallet. I called my mother, crying so hard she thought something terrible had happened, and when I finally managed to explain what the email said, she started crying too. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was going to make it out. The application process was grueling. I had to write multiple essays, submit writing samples, provide transcripts and recommendations from every professor I had ever worked with. Professor Whitmore guided me through every step of the process, answering my nervous emails with patience and encouragement, reading drafts of my essays, and offering feedback that was always constructive and kind. He told me he saw something special in me, a hunger for knowledge that reminded him of himself at my age. He said he wanted to mentor me, to help me become the scholar he knew I could be. Looking back now, I should have wondered why such a famous and busy man was investing so much time in a complete stranger. But I was too grateful, too excited, too desperate to question it. In April of my senior year, I received the notification that I had been awarded the Hartwell Fellowship. I was going to Thornfield University. I was going to study under Professor Daniel Whitmore. My dreams were finally coming true. I arrived in Boston in late August, wide-eyed and overwhelmed by everything around me. Thornfield University was nothing like my small state college. The buildings were old and stately, covered in ivy, filled with students who wore expensive clothes and spoke with an easy confidence that I could only pretend to feel. My fellowship covered a small apartment off campus, and I spent my first week unpacking my meager possessions and trying to figure out how to navigate a city that felt like a foreign country compared to everything I had known. My first meeting with Professor Whitmore in person took place on a sunny September morning in his office on the 3rd floor of Hartley Hall. I had imagined this moment dozens of times, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality. His office was lined floor to ceiling with books, and sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that floated in the air like tiny stars. And there he was, standing to greet me with a warm smile and an outstretched hand, Professor Daniel Whitmore, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a tweed jacket that somehow made him look both brilliant and approachable. "Olivia," he said, and hearing my name in his voice made everything feel suddenly, impossibly real. "I have been looking forward to this meeting for months." I shook his hand, hoping he could not feel how much mine was trembling. "Professor Whitmore, I cannot thank you enough for everything you have done for me. I would not be here without you." He waved away my thanks with a modest gesture. "Nonsense. You are here because of your talent, your dedication, your remarkable work. I simply opened a door. You are the one who walked through it." That first meeting lasted 2 hours. We discussed my research interests, my academic goals, my plans for my thesis. He listened intently to everything I said, asking questions that pushed my thinking in new directions, offering insights that made me see my own ideas in a completely different light. By the time I left his office, I was floating on a cloud of validation and excitement. This was what I had always dreamed of. A mentor who believed in me, who wanted to help me succeed, who saw me as something more than the scholarship girl from the wrong side of the tracks. Over the following months, Professor Whitmore became the center of my academic universe. I took 2 of his classes that first semester, and they were unlike anything I had experienced before. He had a way of making Victorian literature come alive, of connecting century-old texts to contemporary issues, of challenging us to think critically about power, deception, and the stories we tell ourselves. His lectures were performances, really, filled with passion and humor, and moments of genuine insight that left me scribbling notes furiously, trying to capture every word. But it was outside of class that our relationship truly deepened. He invited me to join his research group, a small collection of graduate students who met weekly to discuss their work and receive his feedback. He introduced me to other faculty members, always praising my intelligence and potential. He recommended me for a teaching assistantship that added to my fellowship stipend and gave me valuable experience in the classroom. He was everything a mentor should be, and I trusted him completely. That trust extended to sharing parts of myself that I had never shared with anyone in academia. I told him about my mother, about how she was struggling with health issues back home, about how guilty I felt for being so far away. I told him about my fears of not belonging at Thornfield, of being exposed as a fraud who had somehow fooled everyone into thinking she was smart enough to be there. I told him about the imposter syndrome that kept me awake at night, the voice in my head that whispered I was not good enough, would never be good enough. And he listened. He always listened. He told me about his own humble beginnings, about growing up in a working-class family in Manchester, England, before immigrating to the United States as a young man. He said he understood what it was like to feel like an outsider, to fight for every opportunity, to carry the weight of expectations on your shoulders. He made me feel seen, understood, validated in ways I had never experienced before. It was during my second semester that I began working on what would become my thesis project. I had developed a theory about a specific form of narrative deception in Victorian sensation novels, a pattern I had identified across multiple texts that I believed no other scholar had noticed before. When I presented my initial findings to Professor Whitmore, his eyes lit up in a way I had never seen. "Olivia," he said, leaning forward in his chair with an intensity that took me by surprise, "this is extraordinary. This is exactly the kind of original, groundbreaking work that builds academic careers. You must pursue this immediately." He became deeply invested in my research, meeting with me multiple times per week to discuss my progress, reading every draft I produced, offering suggestions that shaped the direction of my work. He gave me access to his personal library, including rare first editions that he had collected over decades. He connected me with a colleague at another university who had archival materials that proved essential to my argument. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I threw myself into the project with everything I had. Looking back, I should have noticed the warning signs. I should have paid attention to the way his questions sometimes felt less like mentorship and more like interrogation. I should have wondered why he wanted to see every draft, every note, every piece of evidence I collected. I should have trusted my instincts when something felt slightly off, when his interest seemed to cross the line from supportive to possessive. But I was so grateful, so eager to please, so convinced of his good intentions that I ignored every red flag. The first real crack in my trust appeared in April of my first year. I was working late in the graduate student office, finishing a chapter draft, when my friend Marcus stopped by. Marcus Chen was a second-year law student I had met at an orientation event during my first week at Thornfield. We had bonded over our shared status as first-generation college students navigating elite institutions, and he had become one of my closest friends on campus. He had a sharp, analytical mind and a protective streak that sometimes drove me crazy but always made me feel cared for. "You are still working on that Whitmore project?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "You have been practically living in his office for months." I looked up from my laptop, defensive without really knowing why. "It is my thesis, Marcus. Of course I am working hard on it. I am not questioning your work ethic, Liv. I am questioning his." He hesitated, like he was choosing his next words carefully. "I've been asking around about him, talking to some of the older grad students, some alumni. There are some things you should know." My stomach tightened. "What things?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing concrete, just whispers. Stories about former students who had issues with him, a few people who left the program suddenly and would not talk about why. One woman who filed a complaint with the university years ago, but it got buried somehow." I shook my head, annoyed by the implications. "That is just gossip, Marcus. People are jealous of his success. Of course, there are going to be rumors." "Maybe," he said, but his expression made it clear he was not convinced. "Just be careful, okay? Do not share anything with him that you are not comfortable having out there. Protect your work." I thanked him for his concern and went back to my draft, but his words stayed with me longer than I wanted them to. That night, lying in bed, I found myself replaying every interaction I had ever had with Professor Whitmore, looking for signs of something sinister. I found nothing. He had been nothing but supportive, nothing but kind, nothing but the perfect mentor. Marcus was wrong. He had to be wrong. But just to be safe, I started keeping copies of everything. Every draft, every note, every email exchange, I backed up my research to multiple cloud services and external drives. I told myself it was just good academic practice, that any responsible researcher would do the same. But deep down, I knew I was protecting myself against something I could not quite name. Summer came, and I went home to Millbrook to spend time with my mother, who had been diagnosed with a chronic illness that required ongoing treatment. I spent my days helping around the house, and my nights continuing to work on my thesis. Professor Whitmore and I exchanged emails regularly, and he was as encouraging as ever, praising my progress and expressing excitement about the direction my research was taking. When I returned to Thornfield in September for my second year, everything seemed normal at first. I threw myself back into my work, teaching my assigned sections, taking seminars, and making steady progress on my thesis. Professor Whitmore continued to be my primary advisor, meeting with me regularly and providing feedback that helped strengthen my argument. By October, I had a complete draft that I was genuinely proud of, a piece of original scholarship that I believed would make a real contribution to the field. And then, on a crisp Tuesday afternoon, I went to Professor Whitmore's office for a scheduled meeting and heard him on the phone with the dean, describing me as mentally unstable and academically dishonest. I stood frozen outside that door, my body refusing to move, my brain struggling to process what I was hearing. His voice, which had always been so warm and kind when he spoke to me, was now clinical, detached, filled with concern that sounded absolutely genuine. I have tried to help her, of course. That is always my instinct with struggling students. But I am afraid her issues go beyond what I can address. The plagiarism in her thesis is extensive, and when I confronted her about it, she became hostile, even threatening. I am genuinely concerned for her mental state. Plagiarism. The word hit me like a physical blow. I had never plagiarized anything in my life. Every word in my thesis was my own, every idea original, every source meticulously cited. What was he talking about? Why was he lying? I must have made a sound, a gasp or a whimper, because suddenly the conversation on the other side of the door stopped. I heard footsteps approaching, and before I could think to run, the door swung open, and Professor Whitmore was standing in front of me, his face a mask of surprise that quickly shifted to something else, something I had never seen in his eyes before. It was cold, calculating, almost predatory. "Olivia?" he said smoothly, his voice resuming its usual warmth as if a switch had been flipped. "I was not expecting you until 3. Come in, come in." I stood rooted to the spot, staring at him, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the man I had just heard through the door. "What were you saying about me? Who were you talking to?" His expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling into one of gentle concern. "You look pale, dear. Perhaps you should sit down. I was just discussing some departmental matters with Dean Reynolds. Nothing for you to worry about." "You were talking about me." My voice came out stronger than I expected, fueled by a mixture of fear and growing anger. "I heard you. You said I plagiarized my thesis. You said I was mentally unstable." He sighed, a theatrical sound that I now recognized as rehearsed. He guided me into his office and closed the door behind us, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. I remained standing, my arms crossed protectively across my chest. "Olivia, I was afraid this moment would come." He sat down behind his desk, folding his hands in front of him, looking at me with an expression of profound sadness. "I have noticed some concerning patterns in your behavior over the past few months. The paranoia, the mood swings, the tendency to misinterpret ordinary conversations. I did not want to say anything, hoping it would pass, but after discovering the plagiarism in your recent chapter, I felt I had no choice but to involve the administration." My head was spinning. What plagiarism? There is no plagiarism in my work. Everything is original. Is it? He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk toward me. Because these passages seem remarkably similar to sections from an unpublished manuscript I have been working on for the past 5 years. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were printed pages from my thesis, side by side with what appeared to be passages from another document. The highlighted sections were nearly identical, word for word, idea for idea. But that was impossible. I had never seen this other document. I had never read Professor Whitmore's unpublished work. Every word in my thesis had come from my own brain, my own research, my own countless hours of work. I do not understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I did not copy this. I have never even seen your manuscript. Olivia. His voice was gentle, patronizing, the voice you might use with a confused child. I have been sharing my work with you for over a year. In our meetings, in our discussions, I gave you drafts to read, notes to review. It is possible that in your fragile state, you absorbed these ideas and convinced yourself they were your own. It happens more often than you might think. I stared at him, pieces of a horrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. He had never given me drafts of his unpublished work. Never. He had shared published books, articles, well-known sources, but never anything unpublished. But who would believe me? I was a second-year graduate student, a scholarship kid from nowhere, and he was Daniel Whitmore, world-renowned scholar, beloved professor, a man with decades of credibility to his name. You are lying, I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. You are lying about all of this. I do not know why, but you are lying. Something shifted in his face, just for a moment. The mask slipped, and I saw something beneath it that made my blood run cold. It was satisfaction. Whatever was happening, whatever game he was playing, he was enjoying it. I understand this is difficult to hear, he said, the mask sliding back into place. And I want you to know that I do not blame you. Academic pressure can be immense, especially for someone from your background. I have recommended to Dean Reynolds that you be given a leave of absence to focus on your mental health, rather than facing formal disciplinary proceedings. I am trying to protect you, Olivia. Even now. I was shaking, my whole body trembling with a combination of fear and rage. I do not need protection. I need you to tell the truth. He stood, coming around the desk to stand in front of me, close enough that I could smell his cologne. The truth is complicated, dear. The truth is that I took a chance on a girl from a small town who seemed special, and I was disappointed. The truth is that I invested years of my life in research that you seem determined to claim as your own. The truth is that your academic career is over, and the sooner you accept that, the less painful this will be. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. No one will believe you over me. I have spent 30 years building my reputation. You are a nobody. A scholarship girl playing at being a scholar. Go home to your little town, take care of your sick mother, and find a life that suits someone like you. I do not remember leaving his office. I do not remember walking back to my apartment, or climbing the stairs, or unlocking my door. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on my kitchen floor, my back against the refrigerator, sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. Everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had dreamed of, was being ripped away by a man who had seemed so kind, so caring, so invested in my success. But even through the haze of shock and grief, a small voice in the back of my head was asking questions. Why would he do this? What did he have to gain? And if he was lying about the plagiarism, what else might he be lying about? I did not sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my computer, going through every email Professor Whitmore had ever sent me, every document he had ever shared, every note I had taken in our meetings. I was looking for something, anything, that would help me make sense of what had happened. And sometime around 3 a.m, bleary-eyed and running on adrenaline, I found it. In one of his early emails to me, back when I was still an undergraduate applying to the program, Professor Whitmore had mentioned his current research interests. He was working on a book about narrative deception in Victorian sensation novels, specifically examining patterns of unreliable narration across multiple texts. At the time, I had thought it was a coincidence, a sign that we shared similar interests, a reason to believe he was the perfect mentor for me. Now, reading it again with new eyes, I saw something else entirely. He had known about my research topic before he ever met me. He had read my undergraduate paper on unreliable narration in Collins, and he had recognized something in it, something that aligned with work he was already doing. And now, a year and a half later, he was accusing me of stealing from him. The truth crystallized in my mind with terrible clarity. He had not championed my application because he believed in my potential. He had championed it because he wanted access to my ideas. He had been mining my research all along, using our meetings and discussions to extract insights and evidence that he could incorporate into his own work. And now that my thesis was nearly complete, now that I had a fully developed argument that could stand on its own, he was moving to destroy me before I could publish it. He was going to take credit for everything I had done, and he was using accusations of plagiarism to ensure that no one would ever believe my side of the story. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding, my mind racing. It was the perfect crime, really. He had access to my work, access to my emails, access to everything I had ever written. He could easily have taken my thesis chapters and created a fake manuscript predated to before my research began. He could craft any narrative he wanted, and his decades of reputation would make it unquestionable. Against all of that, what did I have? I was nobody, just like he said. Just a scholarship girl from Millbrook who had made the mistake of trusting the wrong person. But I was also my mother's daughter. And my mother had spent her whole life fighting against people who underestimated her, who dismissed her, who thought she did not matter. She had raised me to be a fighter, to never give up, to always search for the truth. And that was exactly what I was going to do. The first thing I did the next morning was call Marcus. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Liv, it is barely 6. What is wrong?" I told him everything, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The phone call I had overheard, the accusations of plagiarism, the documents Professor Whitmore had shown me, the threats, the realization of what he had been doing all along. By the time I finished, I was crying again, my voice breaking on every other word. Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and filled with a cold fury that I had never heard from him before. "Do not do anything yet. Do not talk to anyone. Do not respond to any emails. Do not go anywhere near that man. I am coming over." He was at my apartment within the hour, armed with coffee and legal pads and the kind of focused determination that I imagined served him well in law school. We spent the entire day going through my files, creating timelines, documenting every interaction I had ever had with Professor Whitmore. Marcus had me write down everything I could remember from the phone call I had overheard, word for word. He made me describe the documents in that folder, the fake manuscript, the highlighted passages. He asked questions I had not thought to ask myself, poking holes in my assumptions, challenging me to think like a lawyer. "The good news," he said finally, leaning back on my couch with a sigh, "is that he is not as clever as he thinks he is. If his manuscript is fake, which we both believe it is, there will be ways to prove it. Metadata on documents, access logs, version histories. If you can show that your work predates his supposed manuscript, his whole case falls apart. And how do I do that? He has access to university systems. He could alter anything." Marcus smiled grimly. "But you have backups, right? Independent backups that he does not know about? Cloud storage, external drives, anything that creates a paper trail outside of Thornfield's servers?" I thought about the precautions I had started taking after Marcus's warning back in April. The multiple cloud accounts, the external hard drives, the emails I had sent to myself and to my mother with attached drafts, time-stamped and preserved. At the time, it had felt paranoid. Now, it felt like the smartest thing I had ever done. "I have backups," I said. "Lots of them?" "Good. Then we have something to work with." Marcus stood up, pacing the small living room with the restless energy of someone whose mind was already 3 steps ahead. "Here is what we need to do. First, we secure everything. Every backup, every document, every piece of evidence. We make copies of copies and store them in places he cannot touch. Then we start gathering information about him. You said there were rumors about former students, complaints that got buried. We need to find those people. If there is a pattern, if he has done this before, that changes everything. What if no one will talk to me? What if they are too scared? Then we find other ways. Public records, published papers, anything that shows inconsistencies in his work. A man like this does not just decide to steal from a student out of nowhere. There will be a history. We just have to find it." I looked at Marcus, this friend who had believed me without question, who was putting aside his own work to help me fight a battle that was not his. I felt a surge of gratitude so intense it brought fresh tears to my eyes. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. "Why does this matter so much to you?" He stopped pacing and met my gaze directly. "Because I have seen what people like him do to people like us. Because my mom cleaned offices for professors who treated her like she was invisible. Because I spent my whole life watching people with power abuse it. And I swore that when I could do something about it, I would." He shrugged, a hint of his usual humor returning. "Also, I really, really want to see that pretentious jerk get what is coming to him." Despite everything, I laughed. It felt strange, laughing in the middle of the worst day of my life, but it also felt necessary. It reminded me that I was not alone, that there were people on my side, that this fight was not hopeless. Over the following weeks, I entered a strange double life. On the surface, I complied with the university's request for a temporary leave of absence while the plagiarism allegations were investigated. I stopped attending classes, stopped teaching my sections, stopped going anywhere near Hartley Hall or Professor Whitmore's office. To anyone watching, I was a disgraced student quietly disappearing, exactly as he had planned. But behind the scenes, I was building a case. Marcus and I worked together every evening, following leads, gathering evidence, slowly assembling a picture of who Daniel Whitmore really was beneath his carefully cultivated reputation. It was painstaking work, often frustrating, frequently leading to dead ends. But piece by piece, the truth began to emerge. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I had been searching online for any mention of former Whitmore students, and I stumbled across a personal blog belonging to a woman named Rachel Torres. The blog was mostly about her life as a high school English teacher in Arizona, but buried in the archives was a single post from 8 years earlier, written when she was still a graduate student at Thornfield. The post was titled "Why I Left," and it was only 3 paragraphs long, but those 3 paragraphs made my heart stop. She wrote about a mentor who had taken an interest in her work, who had guided her through her first year of graduate school with warmth and encouragement. She wrote about how that relationship had soured in her second year when she began to suspect that her mentor was incorporating her research into his own without credit. She wrote about going to the department chair with her concerns, only to be dismissed as a confused student who did not understand collaborative scholarship. And she wrote about leaving the program midway through her 3rd year, her academic dreams shattered, her faith in the system destroyed. She never named Professor Whitmore directly. She never named Thornfield University. But the details were too specific to be coincidence. This was his pattern. I was not the first. I sent Rachel Torres an email that night, carefully worded, explaining who I was and what was happening to me. I told her I understood if she did not want to respond, that I would respect her privacy completely. But I also told her that her voice might be the key to stopping him from doing this to anyone else. She did not respond for 3 days. I checked my inbox obsessively, convinced she was going to ignore me, convinced I had reached another dead end, but on the 4th morning, her reply arrived, and it changed everything. Rachel's email was long, detailed, and filled with the raw emotion of someone who had been carrying a burden alone for too long. She confirmed what I had suspected. Professor Whitmore had been her advisor, had cultivated a relationship of trust and mentorship, and then had systematically stolen her research when she got too close to publishing something significant. When she tried to fight back, he had launched a campaign to destroy her reputation within the department, spreading rumors about her mental health, her work ethic, her suitability for academic life. She had tried to file a formal complaint, but the department chair at the time had been a close friend of Whitmore's, and the complaint had gone nowhere. "I left because I could not take it anymore," she wrote. "I was 26 years old and completely broken. He took my ideas, my confidence, my career, but the worst part was that no one believed me. Everyone thought I was just a bitter student who could not handle the pressure. I have spent the last 8 years wondering if I imagined the whole thing, if maybe I really was the problem. Reading your email, knowing that he is doing this to someone else, is both the most validating and the most heartbreaking thing I have ever experienced." She ended her email with a promise. "I will help you in any way I can. It is too late for me to get back what I lost, but maybe I can help you save yourself. And maybe, finally, we can make sure he never does this to anyone again." I read her words through tears, feeling something shift inside me. The fear and confusion that had dominated my thoughts since that terrible afternoon in October were starting to give way to something else. Purpose. I was not just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for Rachel, and for whoever else he had hurt over the years, and for all the future students who might fall into his trap if someone did not stop him. Marcus was ecstatic when I showed him Rachel's email. "This is huge, Liv. If we can establish a pattern of behavior, it completely changes the dynamic. One accusation against a beloved professor is easy to dismiss. Multiple accusations start to look like evidence." But she never filed a formal complaint that went anywhere, and she left the program. How do we prove any of it? We start by finding others. If he did this to you and to Rachel, he almost certainly did it to other students in between. We need to find them. This became our new mission, identifying everyone who had been in Professor Whitmore's orbit over the past 2 decades and figuring out which ones had stories similar to mine and Rachel's. It was detective work of the most tedious kind, involving hours of searching university databases, alumni networks, academic publications, and social media. But gradually, names began to emerge. There was David Okonkwo, a brilliant scholar who had left Thornfield abruptly in the middle of his 4th year and now worked as a librarian in Chicago, never having completed his dissertation. There was Mei Lin, who had transferred to another program citing personal reasons, and whose subsequent academic work showed no signs of the promising research she had been pursuing under Whitmore. There was Thomas Green, who had graduated but never published his thesis despite it being described in department newsletters as groundbreaking, and who now worked in real estate with no apparent connection to academia. One by one, I reached out to these former students, introducing myself, explaining my situation, asking if they were willing to share their experiences. Some never responded. Others replied politely but firmly that they had no interest in revisiting that chapter of their lives. A few blocked me entirely, and I understood. The wounds Professor Whitmore had inflicted ran deep, and not everyone was ready or willing to reopen them. But some did respond. David Okonkwo called me one evening in early December, and we talked for 3 hours. His story was almost identical to mine and Rachel's. Initial warmth, gradual theft of ideas, and then a sudden campaign of destruction when he started asking questions. Maylin wrote me a 20-page email detailing her experiences, which she said she had never told anyone because she was afraid no one would believe her. Thomas Green met me for coffee when I traveled to New York over winter break, and he showed me journals he had kept from his time at Thornfield, documenting in real time his growing suspicions about Whitmore and the way his concerns were dismissed by everyone he approached. With every new story, the picture became clearer. Professor Daniel Whitmore was not just an isolated predator who had targeted me specifically. He was a serial academic thief who had been exploiting students for decades, taking advantage of their trust, their ambition, and their vulnerability to enrich his own career and reputation. His published books, his acclaimed articles, his celebrated theories, how much of it was actually his? How much had been stolen from students like me, students who had given him their best ideas only to watch him claim credit while destroying their careers? By January, we had gathered statements from 7 former students, including myself. Not all of them were willing to go public, but all of them had agreed to share their stories with us, creating a documented pattern of behavior that would be impossible to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. But we still had a problem: proof. Stories were powerful, but stories could be disputed. What we needed was concrete evidence that Professor Whitmore had faked the manuscript he had used to accuse me of plagiarism. What we needed was something that could not be explained away or reinterpreted. What we needed was a smoking gun. That smoking gun came from the most unexpected place imaginable: Professor Whitmore's own daughter. I first heard about Sophie Whitmore from Rachel, who mentioned in passing that Whitmore had a daughter who had briefly attended Thornfield as an undergraduate before transferring to another school. Rachel did not know much about her, just that she existed, and that father and daughter appeared to have a complicated relationship. I looked Sophie up online and found her easily enough. She was 28 years old, working as a social worker in Philadelphia, with a modest social media presence that revealed nothing about her relationship with her famous father. I debated for days whether to reach out to her. What could his daughter possibly tell me? And even if she knew something, why would she betray her own father to help a stranger? In the end, it was not me who made contact. It was Sophie. She emailed me on a gray afternoon in mid-January, using an anonymous account that gave no indication of who she was. The message was brief. I know what my father is, and I know what he did to you. We should talk. We arranged to meet in a neutral location, a quiet cafe in Providence that was roughly halfway between Boston and Philadelphia. I brought Marcus with me for safety, and we arrived early, choosing a corner table with a clear view of the door. When Sophie walked in, I knew immediately who she was. She had her father's height, his angular features, his intelligent eyes. But where his eyes were cold and calculating, hers were sad, haunted, filled with the weight of secrets kept too long. She sat down across from us, ordering only water, her hands trembling slightly. For a long moment, she just looked at me, studying my face as if trying to find something there. "You remind me of Rachel," she said finally. "Same look, same hunger. He always picks the hungry ones." "You know about Rachel?" Sophie nodded, a bitter smile crossing her face. "I know about all of them. David, Mei Lin, Thomas, the others. I have been watching my father destroy promising scholars for my entire adult life, and I have never had the courage to do anything about it." She told us her story, and it was more damning than anything I could have imagined. Sophie had grown up watching her father's behavior from the inside, seeing the steady stream of bright young students who came into his orbit glowing with potential and left broken and diminished. She had tried to warn some of them over the years, dropping hints, suggesting they be careful, but she had never been brave enough to come forward publicly. She was afraid of him, she admitted, afraid of what he might do to her career, to her life if she exposed him. But something had changed when she heard about what was happening to me. She had been following the situation through university gossip networks, watching as her father once again deployed his usual tactics against another promising young woman. And something inside her had finally snapped. "I cannot watch him do this again," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I cannot stand by while he destroys another person's life and gets away with it. Not anymore." What Sophie offered us was beyond anything we had dared to hope for. Over the years, she had quietly collected evidence of her father's misconduct, documents and files that she had copied from his home computer, emails she had secretly forwarded to herself, notes he had left lying around that revealed his true nature. She had amassed this collection without any clear plan for what to do with it, driven by a desperate need to document the truth even if she was too afraid to act on it. Among her collection was a file that made my heart nearly stop. It was an early draft of the manuscript Professor Whitmore had used to accuse me of plagiarism, complete with metadata showing it had been created just 3 months ago, long after my thesis drafts had been written and backed up. The document's properties clearly showed it had been authored after my research was already complete. He had not written this manuscript 5 years ago, as he claimed. He had created it specifically to frame me, copying and slightly altering passages from my own thesis to manufacture fake evidence of plagiarism. "This proves it," Marcus said, his voice hushed with disbelief. "This proves he fabricated the whole thing." Sophie nodded grimly. "There is more. I have emails where he discusses strategy for discrediting students, notes about which ideas to appropriate from which researchers, evidence of at least 3 other cases where he published work that was substantially based on student research without attribution." I stared at her, trying to process what she was offering. "Why are you doing this? He is your father." Sophie's eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw all the pain she had carried, all the guilt and shame and conflict that came with loving someone who had done terrible things. Because he stopped being my father a long time ago. He is a monster wearing a human mask, and someone needs to finally tear that mask away. Over the following weeks, Sophie became an integral part of our team. She provided us with a treasure trove of evidence that we organized, cataloged, and prepared for what was coming next. Marcus consulted with legal experts he trusted, figuring out the best way to present our case without putting any of us at legal risk. Rachel reached out to the other former students, letting them know what we had discovered and inviting them to join the effort if they were willing. By early February, we had assembled a comprehensive dossier documenting Professor Daniel Whitmore's decades-long pattern of academic theft and career destruction. We had testimony from 9 former students. We had documentary evidence showing he had fabricated the manuscript used to accuse me. We had emails and notes revealing his deliberate strategy for exploiting and then discrediting the students he targeted. And we had Sophie, his own daughter, willing to testify to everything she had witnessed from inside his household. The question now was, what to do with it all? "We have 3 options," Marcus explained during one of our strategy sessions. "First, we can go directly to the university administration with everything we have. Second, we can go to the academic community more broadly, reaching out to journals, professional organizations, ethics committees. Third, we can go public, taking this to the media and letting the court of public opinion deliver its verdict. Which option gives us the best chance of actually bringing him down?" I asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. "Honestly, none of them are guaranteed. The university has every incentive to protect him. He is one of their most famous faculty members, brings in research funding, attracts students. They will want to make this go away quietly. The academic community moves slowly and often circles the wagons around its own. And the media—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "The media can be powerful, but it can also be brutal. Once this goes public, there is no controlling the narrative. It could backfire on us as easily as it could hurt him." "So what do we do?" It was Sophie who answered, her voice quiet but firm. "All of them. We do all of them at once." She explained her reasoning. If we went to the university alone, they would try to bury it. If we went to academic organizations alone, the process would drag on for years. If we went to the media alone, we would look like disgruntled students making accusations without evidence. But if we did all 3 simultaneously, creating a coordinated assault on multiple fronts, we would make it impossible for anyone to ignore or suppress. "We give the university a chance to do the right thing," she said, "but we do not give them the chance to cover it up. We submit our evidence to the administration, to the Modern Language Association, and to investigative journalists all on the same day. We make it clear that the story is going to come out whether the university cooperates or not, and then we see what happens." It was a bold strategy, potentially risky, with no guarantee of success. But as I looked around the room at the faces of my allies, Marcus, who had believed in me from the beginning, Rachel, who had found the courage to revisit her trauma, Sophie, who was betraying her own father for the sake of justice, I knew that bold was exactly what this situation required. We set the date for our coordinated action, February 28th. We spent the intervening weeks refining our presentation, anticipating counterarguments, preparing ourselves emotionally for what was coming. The night before, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. I thought about my mother in Millbrook, who had taught me to never stop fighting. I thought about the scholarship girl who had arrived at Thornfield with so much hope and ambition. I thought about all the other scholars whose careers had been destroyed by a man who saw them not as people, but as resources to be exploited. Tomorrow, I would either take the first step toward reclaiming my life, or I would set in motion events that could destroy it even further. There was no middle ground, no safe path, no guaranteed outcome. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, I felt something I had not felt in months. Peace. Whatever happened next, I was no longer hiding, no longer letting him control the narrative, no longer allowing his version of reality to go unchallenged. Tomorrow, the truth would start to come out, and that was worth any risk. February 28th dawned cold and clear, the kind of crisp winter day that feels like a fresh start. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror that morning, looking at my reflection, seeing someone I barely recognized. The exhausted, terrified girl who had fled Professor Whitmore's office 4 months ago was gone. In her place was someone harder, sharper, forged in the fire of betrayal, and tempered by months of relentless work. I was still afraid, still uncertain about what the day would bring, but the fear no longer controlled me. It had become fuel, powering the fight instead of paralyzing it. At exactly 9 o'clock, we executed our plan. Marcus hand-delivered a comprehensive complaint package to Dean Reynolds' office, along with copies to the university president and the chair of the Academic Ethics Committee. Rachel and the other former students who had agreed to participate submitted their statements through official university channels, triggering formal review processes that could not easily be ignored. Sophie, using a pseudonym for protection, sent our evidence package to 3 investigative journalists who covered higher education, along with detailed instructions on how to verify every claim we were making. And I sent an email to Professor Daniel Whitmore himself. I had debated this decision for weeks. Marcus thought it was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Rachel thought it was poetic justice. Sophie thought he deserved to know that his world was about to collapse around him. In the end, I decided to do it for myself, not for him. I needed him to know that I was not the broken victim he had tried to create. I needed him to understand that his actions had consequences. I needed to look the monster in the eye, even if only through the screen of a computer. The email was simple and direct. Professor Whitmore, by the time you read this, the University Administration, the Modern Language Association, and multiple news organizations will have received comprehensive documentation of your decades-long pattern of academic theft and career destruction. They will have evidence proving that you fabricated the manuscript you used to accuse me of plagiarism. They will have testimony from 9 former students describing how you exploited their trust, stole their research, and destroyed their careers when they got too close to the truth. Your mask is coming off. Everything you have built on lies and stolen ideas is about to crumble. I want you to know that this is not revenge. This is justice. And I want you to know that you did not break me. You made me stronger. Olivia Marshall. I hit send at 9:15 in the morning. By 10:30, my phone was ringing with calls from numbers I did not recognize. By noon, the first news story was published online, with the headline, "Thornfield Professor Accused of Decades-Long Academic Fraud Pattern." By the end of the day, Professor Daniel Whitmore was the most talked-about name in academic circles, and the university had issued a statement announcing that he had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of interviews, depositions, meetings, and media appearances. The story had captured public attention in a way none of us had anticipated. It spoke to broader concerns about power dynamics in academia, about the exploitation of vulnerable students, about the way institutions protect their own at the expense of those they should be serving. Journalists reached out to me daily, asking for interviews, wanting to hear my side of the story. Academics across the country weighed in with their own experiences and opinions. The hashtag #BelieveStudents started trending as more and more stories of academic misconduct came to light. Professor Whitmore initially attempted to fight back. His lawyers issued statements denying all allegations. He gave an interview to a sympathetic journalist, portraying himself as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign by disgruntled former students. He claimed that Sophie was mentally unstable and had fabricated evidence to hurt him out of family resentment. He insisted that I was a troubled young woman who had developed an unhealthy obsession with him and had made up my accusations to get attention. But his counterattack only made things worse. Every claim he made was quickly disproven by the evidence we had assembled. The metadata on his fabricated manuscript was analyzed by independent experts who confirmed it could not have been created when he claimed. Former colleagues came forward with their own stories of suspicious behavior they had witnessed over the years. The investigative journalists dug deeper, uncovering additional evidence we had not even known about, including a settled lawsuit from 15 years ago that the university had kept confidential. By mid-March, the tide had turned decisively against him. The university's investigation concluded that there was overwhelming evidence of academic misconduct, and Professor Whitmore was officially terminated. The Modern Language Association opened its own review, which would likely result in the retraction of multiple publications and permanent damage to his professional standing. Several of his former students began exploring legal options for civil suits. And then there was me. In the midst of all the chaos, something remarkable happened. The university reinstated me in the graduate program. The plagiarism allegations against me were formally withdrawn. My academic record was cleared, and I was invited to continue my thesis under a new advisor. The Hartwell Fellowship was renewed, with additional support provided as acknowledgement of what I had been through. I remember the moment I received that notification, standing in my kitchen, staring at my phone in disbelief. After everything, after months of fighting, after believing that my academic career was over, I was being given a second chance. The tears came then, different from all the tears before. These were tears of relief, of vindication, of gratitude for the people who had believed in me when I could barely believe in myself. But the story does not end there. Justice is rarely as simple as a villain being punished and a hero being rewarded. The road to rebuilding my life was longer and more complicated than I could have imagined. The first challenge was returning to Thornfield. Even with Professor Whitmore gone, even with my name cleared, the campus was no longer the place of hope and possibility it had once seemed. Too many people had been involved in protecting him, in dismissing concerns, in perpetuating a system that allowed predators to thrive. I walked through Hartley Hall that first day back and felt the weight of memory pressing down on me, the echoes of everything that had happened in those hallways and offices. My new advisor, Dr. Helen Graves, was a stark contrast to Professor Whitmore. She was methodical, rigorous, and completely uninterested in charm or charisma. She made clear from our first meeting that her role was to help me develop my scholarship, not to become my friend or surrogate parent. At first, this coldness was jarring, especially after the intense mentorship relationship I had experienced before. But over time, I came to appreciate her approach. She treated me as a professional, respected my ideas on their own merits, and never once made me feel indebted to her for her guidance. The thesis itself required significant revision, not because there was anything wrong with my original work, but because the process of exposing Professor Whitmore had revealed connections and implications that I had not previously considered. My research on narrative deception in Victorian literature had taken on new meaning in light of my own experience with a master deceiver. I rewrote major sections, incorporating what I had learned about the real-world impact of manipulation and false narratives. The final product was stronger, more nuanced, and more personal than anything I could have produced before my ordeal. I defended my thesis in April of the following year, almost exactly 2 years after that terrible afternoon when I had overheard Professor Whitmore on the phone with the dean. The defense committee was unanimous in their approval, and several members commented on the exceptional quality of my analysis. When I walked out of that room with the title of doctor attached to my name, I felt a complicated mixture of emotions: pride, relief, sadness for what could have been, and determination to use my new platform to prevent others from experiencing what I had experienced. But what happened to Professor Whitmore himself? I think about this more than I probably should, wondering if justice was truly served, or if a man like him ever really faces the consequences he deserves. His academic career was destroyed, that much is certain. The termination from Thornfield, the retraction of publications, the loss of professional standing, these were devastating blows to someone who had built his entire identity around his scholarly reputation. But he was not left destitute or imprisoned. He retained his substantial savings, his expensive Boston townhouse, his network of supporters who believed in his innocence despite all evidence to the contrary. The civil suits filed by former students, including one I joined, were settled out of court. The terms were confidential, but the settlement allowed him to avoid admitting guilt publicly while providing some measure of compensation to those he had harmed. It was a compromise, imperfect and unsatisfying, but it was what the legal system offered. What really brought his downfall home to me was not any formal consequence, but a chance encounter 2 years after my thesis defense. I was at an academic conference in New York, presenting a paper that drew on my research, when I saw him across a crowded reception room. He looked older, diminished, a shadow of the commanding presence he had once been. He was standing alone, nursing a drink, watching the crowd with an expression that I recognized immediately: envy. He was watching a world that had moved on without him, a world where his name was now synonymous with scandal rather than scholarship. Our eyes met across the room. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I felt the old fear surge up briefly, an instinctive reaction to the man who had nearly destroyed me. But then I noticed something else in his eyes, something I had never seen there before: fear. He was afraid of me. He was afraid of what I represented, of the power I now had, of the reputation I was building on the ashes of the one he had tried to steal. I did not approach him. I did not speak to him. I simply held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned away and rejoined my colleagues. That silent confrontation said everything that needed to be said. I had won, not through revenge or cruelty, but through truth and persistence and the courage to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. There were others whose stories intertwined with mine in the years that followed. Rachel Torres eventually returned to academia, encouraged by the validation of seeing her experience acknowledged and believed. She completed a delayed doctorate at another institution and is now a professor herself, dedicated to mentoring students with the care and integrity that was denied to her. We stay in touch, bound by shared trauma, but also by shared triumph. Marcus Chen graduated from law school and went on to specialize in cases involving institutional misconduct in educational settings. He tells me I inspired his career path, though I think he was always destined to fight for the underdog. We remain close friends, the kind of friendship that was forged in crisis and cannot be broken by distance or time. Sophie Whitmore struggled for years with the aftermath of exposing her father. Their relationship, already strained, became completely severed after the investigation made her involvement clear. She told me once that he had written her a letter calling her every ugly name he could think of, blaming her for his downfall, denying until the end that he had done anything wrong. She never responded to the letter. She said she had finally made peace with the fact that the man she wished her father had been was only ever a fiction. As for me, I completed my doctorate and was offered a position at a university in the Midwest, far from the shadow of Thornfield and everything it represented. I teach Victorian literature to undergraduates who remind me of myself at that age, hungry and hopeful and full of potential. I mentor graduate students with the care and boundaries that healthy mentorship requires, always mindful of the power dynamics that can so easily become toxic. I published my thesis as a book that received positive reviews and modest recognition. I built a career that my mother, who lived to see me defend my dissertation before passing away the following year, told me she was incredibly proud of. And I tell my story. Not in every class, not in every conversation, but when it matters, when I see a student who seems to be struggling with something they cannot name, when I sense that someone needs to know they are not alone. I tell them about the man who tried to steal my ideas and destroy my career. I tell them about the friends who helped me fight back. I tell them about the documents and the evidence and the coordinated campaign that brought a powerful man to his knees. And I tell them the most important lesson I learned through all of it, that truth, pursued with patience and courage, and allies who believe in you, is more powerful than any lie, no matter how elaborate. Looking back now, years removed from that terrifying moment outside Professor Whitmore's office door, I can see how the experience shaped me in ways both painful and valuable. I lost my innocence about academia, about mentorship, about the people who claim to want to help us. I gained a deep understanding of how power operates, how predators choose their victims, how institutions protect themselves at the expense of individuals. I learned that being right is not enough, that truth without evidence is just a claim waiting to be dismissed. And I learned that the people who stand with you when everything seems hopeless are more precious than any professional success. Would I go through it all again, knowing what I know now? It is a question I have asked myself many times, and I never come up with a clear answer. The pain was real, the fear was real, the months of uncertainty and fighting were exhausting beyond description. But so was the growth, the strength I discovered in myself, the relationships I built with people who became like family. The person I am today would not exist without the crucible of that experience, and I have made peace with that complicated truth. Professor Daniel Whitmore took many things from me. He took my trust, my belief in the goodness of mentors, my sense of safety in academic spaces. But he did not take the thing that mattered most, my future. That future belonged to me, built on my own ideas and my own work, and my own determination to succeed despite everything he threw at me. In the end, that is the revenge that matters most. Not destruction, not public humiliation, not watching someone else suffer the way they made you suffer. The real revenge is building a life of meaning and purpose and connection, a life that stands as living proof that the person who tried to break you failed. Every class I teach, every student I mentor, every article I publish, every moment of professional success is a quiet rebuke to the man who told me I was nobody, that I would never amount to anything, that I should go back to my small town and accept my place in the world. I am not in that small town anymore. I am not the powerless scholarship girl he thought he could exploit and discard. I am Dr. Olivia Marshall, and my story is my own. There is one more thing I want to share before I end this story. It is something that happened just a few months ago, something that brought everything full circle in a way I could never have predicted. I received an email from a young woman named Jennifer, a first-year graduate student at a university in California. She had read my book, she wrote, and she needed to talk to me about something that was happening to her with her advisor, something that sounded terrifyingly familiar. I read her email 3 times, each reading bringing back a flood of memories. The hope turning to confusion, the confusion turning to fear, the fear turning to desperation. She was at the beginning of a journey I knew all too well, and she was reaching out because she had recognized something in my story that matched her own experience. We set up a video call for the following week. When Jennifer's face appeared on my screen, I saw myself from years ago, young, scared, unsure whether to trust her own perceptions. I listened to her describe her situation, the mentorship that had started so promisingly and was now turning strange and controlling. The ideas she had shared that were now appearing in her advisor's work without credit, the subtle threats and gaslighting that were making her question her sanity. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for. What should I do? I took a deep breath, thinking about everything I had learned, everything I wished someone had told me when I was in her position. And then I started talking. I told her to document everything, to save every email, every draft, every piece of evidence in multiple secure locations, to find allies she could trust, people who would believe her and help her fight, to understand that the system was not designed to protect her, and she would need to be strategic about how she approached it. To take care of her mental health, because the road ahead would be long and difficult, and she would need every ounce of strength she could muster. And I told her the most important thing of all. You are not crazy. You are not imagining this, and you are not alone. I believe you, and I am going to help you. Jennifer's case is ongoing. I cannot share the details, but I can tell you that she is fighting back, using the playbook we developed all those years ago, adapted for her specific situation. She has allies now, including me. She has evidence. She has a plan. And she has something else that I hope makes all the difference. She has hope. That hope is my real legacy, far more than any book or article or academic achievement. Every time someone reads my story and recognizes their own experience in it, every time a survivor reaches out because they finally have words for what was done to them, every time a young scholar decides to fight back instead of giving up, that is the true consequence of everything I went through. That is the truth revealed, the karma delivered, the justice achieved. Professor Daniel Whitmore thought he could take my ideas, destroy my reputation, and silence my voice. Instead, he created an advocate who will spend the rest of her career making sure people like him cannot hide in the shadows anymore. He wanted me to be nobody. Instead, he made me someone who helps other nobodies find their voices. If there is a moral to this story, it is simply this: the powerful are not invincible. The truth, properly documented and strategically deployed, can topple empires built on lies. And the broken pieces of a shattered dream can be rebuilt into something stronger and more beautiful than the original ever was. My name is Olivia Marshall. A professor once tried to steal my work and destroy my life. He failed. And I am still standing, still fighting, still telling the truth. That is how this story ends. Not with anger or bitterness, but with purpose. Not with a defeated victim, but with a survivor who turned her pain into power. Not with an unanswered betrayal, but with justice, hard-won and deeply satisfying. The professor who turned into my enemy made the biggest mistake of his career when he decided to target me, because I was never the weak scholarship girl he thought I was. I was my mother's daughter, and my mother taught me to never ever stop fighting for what is right. He forgot that lesson. I never did. And in the end, that made all the difference.